Okay. I can also pause.
I'm letting everyone in.
And you'll mute everyone.
Yeah. Perfect.
Great. Brilliant. Everyone's joining. I'm being... Okay.
I've just
brilliant.
spotlighted you both too.
Thank you. Great. Fantastic. We'll just allow for people to join. Give it another couple of minutes and then we'll get started. Great. Okay. We'll wait one more minute and then we'll get going. Bypass. Brilliant. Okay, great. Let's get going. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on this wonderful Sunday evening. My name is Philip Braham. I am the founder of ManyMatch.io, and I'm delighted to be joined by Steve Bellingham, Director of Nursing at Cromwell Hospital, which is owned by the Bupa Group. This presentation is on Cromwell Hospital and also on Steve's wonderful career to date, and how Bupa really recruits, trains and retains its nurses. So we're gonna get started and move on to the next slide. Just to let you know, this is being recorded, so people who haven't seen it tonight will be able to access it after the presentation. And we have a Q&A at the end. We have a Q&A, so question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So please do put your questions in the chat box. The chat box should be on your bottom right, so please put your questions in there. I will then moderate and ask Steve. So your questions will be directed, I assume, predominantly at Steve, but you can ask more general recruitment questions to myself. So yeah, please do leave questions. You can ask questions about anything to do with recruitment, anything to do with your training, anything to do with interviews, anything to do with the NHS or the private sector, and we'll do our best to answer that. So let's go to the next slide. The speakers today is myself and Steve. As you can see there, we look a lot younger there. Healthcare has definitely aged us, although Steve, you still look very young.
I was going to say, speak for yourself.
So this is the agenda. We're firstly going to talk about Bupa and the Cromwell Hospital, a bit about the hospital that Steve does work in. Steve will then talk about his personal journey. I think it's really important to listen to people's personal journeys, all the trials and tribulations to get up to that director of nursing position. He'll talk about the highs and the lows, and probably provide some really insightful advice for fellow nurses. We're going to look at kind of the lay of the land at the moment, We're going to look at kind of the macro picture, reasons why nurses leave their jobs, kind of looking at the bigger picture when it comes to staff shortages, the challenges that you face with recruiting nurses, but also the opportunities that come with that. And also why we're here as well, to understand how Steve and his team train and retain their nurses at the Cromwell Hospital. Training and retention are two massive topics across the healthcare sector, and it's really important that we hear from Steve about that. And then we'll tell you a little bit more about MediMatch and the exciting things we're doing here with our technology, but also our community building. So Steve, tell us a bit more about where you're working at the moment, the Cromwell Hospital.
Super, thanks Philip, and thanks everyone for having me along this evening. It's a really exciting opportunity to talk to you all and tell you a little bit about myself, but also about Bupa and the Cromwell for any of those of you who haven't heard of us. So the Cromwell is an acute independent sector hospital in central London. We're based in Kensington, just south of the river. We are a multi-service acute speciality hospital, and we do more or less everything from primary care right into acute hospital services. And the really unique thing for us about that within the independent sector is actually, short of obstetrics and perhaps inpatient psychiatry, patients are really able to access the vast majority of their hospital care pathway within the Cromwell. And that could be right from visiting a GP for an ailment or a problem that needs a diagnosis or a workup, into the hospital diagnostics program and perhaps having tests, scans, x-rays, blood tests, whatever that might be, consulting physicians, and then having surgical or other treatment within the hospital facility, right through to end-of-life care. And that's really quite special, both within the independent sector, but particularly within London, because what it does create is a hospital that's a really exciting place to work, because although we're small in terms of big NHS hospital size, we're really varied in the work we do, which makes it a really special place to work. The hospital's been around a long time, opened in 1981 originally, and was really built to be that full service local hospital, both for people within London, but also in the wider UK, and people who travel overseas to access healthcare as well. Became part of Bupa in 2008. Hopefully I don't need to do too much of an introduction around Bupa itself as an organisation, but a global healthcare insurer and provider of healthcare, and within the UK, actually, providing a lot of services that people might not necessarily expect. So a huge amount of GP and primary care services within the organisation, dental services, care home business, which includes Bupa's care homes and Richmond care villages, and the Cromwell as its hospital. So we are unique in Bupa in the UK in that we're the only hospital that Bupa operates in the UK, although Bupa does operate hospitals in other parts of the world, particularly Spain, Chile, Poland, and other parts of the globe as well. And really the unique opportunity for us in that is being part of that overall Bupa mission. So that the bottom left of the screen there, you can see that our mission is really about helping people live longer, healthier, happier lives, and more recently translating that into making a better world. So Bupa is an organisation that is customer-centric and customer-focused in its journey, and the Cromwell really shares that, and it is a very live part of our mission. But also we're really focused on doing that in a sustainable way that meets the needs of our customers, but also of future generations. And it's a really important part of the way we work and the organisation works. So all of that serves to actually make the Cromwell and Bupa a really exciting place to work and be part of. What it does in addition to that is makes us part of a huge challenge in healthcare recruitment right now, particularly in the ability to deliver those variable services, because unlike smaller hospitals who might specialise in particular conditions, orthopedics, for example, or other models of care, actually you need a really varied group of staff to run a multi-service hospital, and a really varied group of skills, knowledge and experience to make that work successfully, which for us is a real opportunity in that our staff have a huge opportunity to move through specialities while staying within the organisation and particularly within the hospital. But also it means we've got to cast our net really wide to get those skills in the first place. So I think that hopefully gives you a little bit of context to what is a really varied and exciting place to be and to work in.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. Let's talk a little bit about yourself. Really interested to hear more about your career, Steve. Where you started, and how you really got to kind of that director of nursing position. I think also understanding the challenges you faced along the way would be really important for our audience to understand. It's never going to be that easy. It'd be really good to understand the challenges, and also advice that you could give to the audience, things that you may have done differently as well.
Yeah, thanks, and a lot of really interesting questions in there.
Sorry,
so we'll do some of them.
Question overload.
You may need to jump in if
Yeah,
I haven't answered all of them, but hopefully I'll get to some of them for you. So I pride myself on coming from Northern Ireland. I don't think my accent's as strong now as it once used to be, but I grew up in Northern Ireland, about an hour outside of Belfast, and really always had intended to work in healthcare of some degree or another, although I spent many years in my kind of late teenage years flitting about between various different conditions and specialities that I thought I might work in. I settled on nurse training probably into my kind of sixth form years, so third level education. Had been working in nursing homes as a care assistant, and really was exposed to, in a very short space of time, both probably the best and worst of care home environments in a very short space of time. I was really lucky to work in what was probably one of the best care homes in Northern Ireland at the time, and also really lucky and really unfortunate to work in what might have been one of the worst at the time, which drove me into really deciding that nursing was probably the right career for me. Took a long time to decide where to do that. It eventually settled on coming to London, and arrived at King's in London in 2004, and was absolutely only staying in England for 3 years, and was definitely going home to Northern Ireland at the end of those 3 years to work. It was absolutely the ambition. That was about 17 years ago, for context, and I still live in England for anyone who's guessing. Mm-hmm. So it didn't quite work out like that. And I guess one of the things around that kind of journey and into my current role is actually, in my career, I've probably done every single job I said I would never do, or would never want to do, or never be interested in. So very early on in my career, I thought I didn't want to work in emergency medicine. I thought I didn't want to work in acute care. And I was working at the time in St Thomas's, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is an acute NHS trust in central London. I was working in a specialist respiratory high dependency unit, where I'd spent time training. Had gone off and got a job elsewhere, and had come back to this environment to work in, thought, gosh, that the kind of specialist 2-to-1 nursing ratio, really specialist care, really interesting respiratory weaning, great patient group, great career development prospects, really amazing in central London, and really did enjoy it, found it really fulfilling, really enjoyed working in that environment, but very quickly found it to be actually quite samey, and very quickly thought, gosh, what's next? As kind of 23, what do I do? Where do I go from here? Thought I'd like to do some traveling. At the time, Australia, New Zealand seemed really attractive, but there's quite a bit of challenge around some of the visas at the time, and various access into jobs in the area. It was just around the time that UK training had formally switched from diploma into degree-only routes, and I'm diploma trained originally. So I thought, gosh, this might be quite tricky, not really sure what to do. And a friend of mine sent me a newspaper advert at the time and said, look, there's this job, it's on the Falkland Islands, they speak English, and you could go and work there. And I thought, crikey, so got a map out, roughly worked out the Falklands was somewhere in the South Atlantic Ocean, somewhere off the coast of South America. I thought, gosh, that'll be fun. Interviewed for it. Found myself working in this kind of 27-bedded hospital that really was genuinely the only care provision for 500 or 600 miles in any direction. So, we're talking about a big military operation in that environment, as well as a local community who have care needs, in addition to a tourist industry where you're talking about cruise ships docking in Stanley that triple the population of the town in 12 hours. So, you know, probably one of the most diverse jobs I've ever done, and really interesting because actually as a population, they're small, they're self-determinate, that they're really clear on what they want to achieve. But all of that meant there wasn't a whole lot of regulation or red tape around it, because the entire healthcare for the whole islands and everybody associated with it was provided by about 6 doctors and 15 nurses. So, you know, everybody knew everybody. There was a real trust in that healthcare system that really led to individuals, in most cases, working really hard to do the right thing and provide really great quality of services and care. But in some cases actually led to the opposite, because you didn't necessarily have the infrastructure, the supporting mechanisms, some of the quality and regulation that's wrapped around healthcare in more evolved healthcare economies. And that did lead to things going wrong, and not always a lot of learning from those things, which really frustrated me early on in my career, because I thought, you know, I've come from this really big teaching hospital environment where absolutely we make mistakes where things go wrong, but, you know, we deal with those, we manage them, we learn from them, and we create better care as a result of it. But so I quickly realized, whilst I really loved living in the environment and really loved the type of work that I was doing, that it probably wasn't going to be for me in the long term. And a couple of years later, came back into the NHS and went to work in Devon in acute medicine. And bear in mind, at the beginning of this, I said I was never ever going to work in A&E. Well, at this stage, I'd worked in an A&E environment for about 2.5 years. And I got a job in an acute medical unit in Devon, rotating between an AMU and an accident and emergency department. For again, what was a really busy, diverse hospital. And I transitioned into my kind of first managerial role in there, where I took a band 6 deputy manager type role in that environment. And I think, again, loved the work, loved the patient interaction, loved the real acuity of what we were doing, but really struggled with the kind of NHS environment of the length of time it took to get things done at the time. So, you know, I worked with probably the most innovative group of people I've ever had the privilege of working with in that job, who were full of passion, full of great ideas, absolutely knew, how to get the job done, but, you know, did struggle to affect change on any sort of scale. And I think that became a real challenge for me personally, because, you know, I was young, I was full of enthusiasm, really wanted to make a difference really quickly, and got very frustrated where I couldn't do that. And although, you know, in hindsight, when I look back now, we absolutely did make a difference. We changed things, we made things better. We also continued on with things that had worked really well and were really fantastic parts of care. But at the time, it just wasn't fast enough for me, and it wasn't fulfilling my need to feel that sense of change at pace. So
can I ask a question, Steve? Just
yeah, of course you can.
Because a lot of the audience may be interested in a couple of questions I have. When you talk about going from band 5 to band 6, what's the major differences, you know, in that step up to a more senior role? What are the differences? What did you find were the challenges you had to overcome? And what advice would you give to the?
So I think for me, it was very much around being responsible for elements of the service or care outside of that 12-hour shift. So, right. You know, as a band 5 nurse, and even into the kind of upper end of that senior band 5 nurse, you're regularly taking charge of a ward environment, regularly caring for a group of patients, and being responsible for other staff on a shift running that department at that period of time. But the reality is, you get to 8:30 or whatever your shift time end is, and you go home. Someone else takes over, and you very much, you know, hand over and check out of that environment at that period of time. The band 6 role was my kind of first foray into, oh gosh, I have responsibility tomorrow, even though I'm not here. And that was really pretty scary at that stage, to be honest. But I think what it did was bring with it a real great set of opportunities, because there was an opportunity to think about why we were doing the things we were doing, what order we were doing things in, how we were bringing people into that and bringing people along with it. And realizing, I think, quite quickly that I had a responsibility to make sure that things I was capable of doing or able to be done actually could still be done when I went home. And you know, I got a call one night about, I don't know, 11 o'clock at night. I'd finished my shift, had gone home, to say, oh, you know, X, Y, and Z hadn't happened, and we thought you were responsible for making that happen. And it was the first time where I really thought, crikey, I've got a level of responsibility here outside of that kind of 12-hour period. But I think what it brought with it was a lot of opportunity around conversations with colleagues, a lot of really constructive challenge to the way that I thought about nursing, thought about delivery of care, and thought about organisation of care, which was really quite exciting early on in my career.
Great. And one last question before we move on. You talked about kind of, wanting to, you're young, you're enthusiastic, you wanted to make change. What advice would you have for the audience when you are dealing with potentially difficult managers, or people that may be stuck in their ways, that have done things a certain way, and you come in, this young enthusiastic nurse, and all of a sudden you come with your ideas? How do you get those ideas across?
Do you know what? I think it's about taking every opportunity that's presented to you, and sometimes even about doing things that there's good rationale for that you may not think is actually the right thing to do, but being really clear in understanding how you make those changes. I think the biggest mistake I made in those early days in that band 6 role is, I'll be really honest, I thought I knew a lot more than I probably really did, and I went in and said, I know how to make this better. And I was talking to guys who'd been there 15, 20, 25 years. They knew how to do their job, they knew how to look after their patients, they knew what they were doing. They didn't necessarily need or particularly want someone like myself telling them it could be done differently. So, it was about taking those opportunities to do it. Subtly is probably the wrong word, but naturally and organically. So where there was a gap in care or a need that needed to be filled, actually having that opportunity to step in and say, guys, I know how to do this, or I know how we could do this in a way that makes all of our lives a bit easier, and really showing people the benefit of that. I think avoiding going in with that kind of headstrong, we're going to do it my way approach was something I had to learn the hard way really quite quickly.
Great. And you continued your journey. So you went from band 6, and you've obviously worked, you've gone up the ranks, and talk through kind of that moving up the ranks, into that director of nursing position, the challenges you faced, the training that you may have done, the specialties as well that you've gone into, and what you've learned along the way.
So I had a really unique opportunity at that point in my career to move from the NHS into the independent sector, and I moved back to London, took a job in a fairly big London hospital group at the time, working as a night charge nurse, night sister type role. So the most senior nurse in the hospital out of ours, responsible for kind of managing operations and keeping things safe overnight. And again, it was such a culture shock for me in terms of the change, because here I was suddenly in this environment where actually if you had an idea or a problem that you could solve, you could do it really quickly. But equally, you had a group of people who had been in the environment for much, much longer than colleagues in the NHS, who had perhaps much less outside influence than colleagues in the NHS, and weren't necessarily as prone to change. And given what I just said about my NHS role, that was a real shock for me, because I hadn't expected it. And I found myself quite quickly finding opportunities both within the organisation I'd worked for and externally. So I always thought I wanted to go up the kind of director of nursing route quite early on in my career, and I talked to a number of mentors, colleagues and friends about the best way to do that, and everybody told me, you've got to be a ward manager, you've got to put your time in as a ward manager to go up that route. And at the time I was doing nursing education and practice development, and it was a part of probably one of the most exciting roles I'd ever done, because it was about enabling really great care through teaching, training, supporting colleagues, mentoring individuals. And I was really excited about that job, but I had this niggle in the back of my head, which is, you've got to put time in as a ward manager if you want to get up into operational management in nursing. And I took a job at another London hospital at the time that didn't have a great reputation, but I'd met the director of nursing, thought she was phenomenal, was really, really enthused by the setup that I had arranged, and thought it was going to be an amazing job, and moved my whole life out of London up to Buckinghamshire to do this job. it's not where the hospital was based, but decided we'd do this. Was just about to get married at the time, took this job, thought this is amazing and it's absolutely the right thing to do. Made a really fundamental mistake in that the team I was actually going to be working with and for, the senior leaders weren't available at the time I interviewed, and I didn't meet them during the interview process. And I got into this kind of job, turned up at my first day, actually working for an entirely different set of people than the people I met during the interview process, and very quickly realized that the culture wasn't something that I necessarily felt comfortable with, and wasn't an environment that I was hugely comfortable in working in. And actually left that job quite quickly, left it about 8 weeks later, which again, at the time, everybody told me, that's probably not a great idea. You want to at least do it for a year because of how that looks on your CV. But do you know what? I was in an environment I wasn't comfortable. I didn't feel comfortable going to work there every day. I didn't feel I was bringing my best self to work every day. And I rang up a friend at a previous organization who said, if you're not taking your best self to work, what's the point? So, come and do something else. And I got an opportunity to take an interim job somewhere else. And that job was in quality and governance and patient safety. And again, on the list of jobs I said I'm never going to do, that was job number 3. And all of a sudden found myself in this quality and governance space. And within about 3 weeks, realized I loved it, realized it was a place I could make a career in, realized it was something I could absolutely make a difference in doing. And whilst it was really challenging to influence change, to work with colleagues who might not be in that same space around change, it was just phenomenal. We were doing something different every day, and my career progressed from there, and I've been in quality safety and governance ever since. I joined the Cromwell in 2021 as head of governance and clinical quality, and got the opportunity to step into an interim director of nursing at December time last year, when my predecessor had left for another opportunity, and substantively in that role since March this year. So I suppose some of the key points for me in that are that, for me, it was really about taking every opportunity, and even opportunities that seemed really scary or seemed like they might not get me to where I wanted to go. It was really important to go and do them, to take the learning from them, and to put in that work, because I've honestly, although I've definitely done jobs in my career I didn't enjoy as much as others, I've never done a job that hasn't added something in terms of value to the way I work, the way I deliver my current stuff in this role. And I think that's one of my most important takeaways, is that, not every opportunity is going to come along at exactly the perfect time, but actually there's something to be taken from all of those, and you'll get something really strong out of it.
Yeah. I absolutely agree. And I think also, you talk about adversity, where you started a job and you didn't, it didn't work out. These are all learning. I think that's the really interesting thing, which is the positivity that you can get from some of these experiences that you've had, and you can take a lot of that into your next job, take that into kind of your more senior positions. And one of the things that I do want to talk about later on as we go through is culture. You mentioned culture and creating the right culture, and that's something I want to learn from you as to how you create a fantastic culture. So as we move on, I think it's really interesting. We talk about a lot of the challenges in the industry. It's healthcare is in the news every day. All the challenges are in the news, the budgets, the funding, and obviously, of course, one of the big reasons is the challenges when it comes to staffing. And Medimatch ourselves, we are incredibly data driven. We create and we look at a lot of the data and the analytics around staffing and around nurses in particular. And this is some of the data that we've got, and the number one reason why nurses are leaving their jobs is career progression. You obviously have higher salaries. You're looking at whether there's a lot of arguments about pay rises for nurses. Job happiness is a third one. People not necessarily being so happy within their current jobs. People wanting more flexibility. I think that's a really important topic of conversation. You know, I think the world's changed a lot. So how can we be more flexible? And it'd be interesting to hear some of the things that you've done in your organization. And another one is relocation. You know, people are now, there is a massive global shift, right? There is global mobilization of talent. People are moving around the world. People are moving to different cities. You mentioned something incredibly fascinating, which was moving to the Falkland Islands. I mean, that is, you know, crazy, but it's really interesting. And so relocation, not only within the UK and maybe moving to London or away from London or even to Northern Ireland, but also nurses moving to the UK and also nurses from the UK moving to different parts of the world. It'd be really interesting to hear that, especially Bupa being a global organization. So it's really useful to understand kind of the reasons why nurses are leaving their jobs. I don't know if you have anything to kind of add to that slide.
No, I mean, it was interesting. We talked just before the start of this around this being Medimatch data, but actually I think this really underpins my experience of talking to my teams, to my people, to the people I work with, and to people I'm interviewing for jobs. This is why people tell me that they've decided to move on or go into the next job. And there's a real opportunity, I think. I mean, these things sound really challenging, and they are really challenging, and I don't want to underplay that, but there's a real opportunity for employers here to get behind some of these things and deliver real change right now in healthcare to actually help it be a better place to work and a better place to want to stay. And, you know, things like job happiness, change of job pattern, relocation. Actually, you know, Bupa is a huge organization. So, you know, at the Cromwell, we might have a department that opens 8 to 6, and we might not be able to offer much flex out of those particular hours if you want to work in that department. But we might be able to find you that degree of flex elsewhere in the organization or with partner organizations. So it's one of the really great benefits of working in what is a bit of a global healthcare economy, because, you know, we shouldn't be afraid to step out into those different spaces to seek what we think we want. And equally, I think, as I hope I demonstrated in my personal journey, we also shouldn't be afraid to step back if it hasn't worked and hasn't delivered what we wanted. And, you know, when I was in that space of potentially leaving that job I talked about, you know, everybody told me it's going to be disastrous, you're going to struggle to get another job, it's going to be really hard. It wasn't any of those things. I had to explain it, I had to talk to it, I had to be honest, but you know, I genuinely don't believe it stopped me progressing in my career, and in fact quite the opposite, because I think it's shown me as someone who has a very clear sense of self and of what is important to me. And actually, you know, what I do now is I do my homework before I go into organizations, and I've never since worked for a boss I haven't met prior to starting it. I don't think I ever would, to be really honest, even if it's virtually. So you know, I think those things are really important, but I think it's really important with all of them to be absolutely open-minded. And you know, we hear the pressures around cost of living, we hear the pressures around salary and fair wage for fair work, but you know, how do we make that work for every individual, and what are people getting out of those different experiences? And I think it's one of the things that is quite unique about the independent sector, and particularly how we do things at the Cromwell. Do you want me to talk to this, Philip? So just mute if you...
Yeah, sorry, I muted myself. National nurse shortages. I alluded to it before. We mentioned about you know, that the NHS and the healthcare sector is in the news pretty much every day, and it's a lot to do with, you know, the workforce and the staff shortage. And I think it's fascinating to see kind of how many nurses we could be short of within the next few years. But one point that's really important to myself, and we were talking about it before, is kind of that the issues around burnout and the issues around mental health. And I think it's, you know, this presentation is a lot about how we retain and how we train nurses, but I think one of the important factors that we really need to look at is people's well-being. 28% of NHS nurses are quitting within the 3 years of graduation due to burnout and mental health consequences. This is a 50% increase since 2013. That is a lot. And I just want to understand your take on kind of those two points, burnout and mental health, and kind of how you do things within your organization. Is there kind of an open door policy? Do you have events that you run? Do you have a lot of one-to-ones? Talk me through kind of what leaders could be doing differently, or as you're becoming a leader, or even if you're not becoming a leader, what can you do with your colleagues and your friends within the department to kind of look out for certain things or help people?
Yeah, thanks. Again, a really interesting set of questions, and those are really staggering statistics, aren't they? And anyone who's not shocked by them, I mean, I've read them and read them most days in my work, but they still shock me. And I think that's important, because if we stop getting shocked by them, we risk not challenging them or doing something about them. But I'm not aware of any other professional group outside of healthcare where 28% attrition rate in the first 3 years of graduation would be seen as acceptable. It's just not. And if we think about the last 2 or 3 years where we've had a global pandemic, where we've had nurses and healthcare professionals working in ways they've never been asked to work before, to looking after sicker patients in environments that aren't necessarily set up for them, all of this is predictable, because we've had a building staff shortage in the UK and internationally for a number of years now. So I've heard stories of colleagues who I consider exceptional nurses coming home from shifts literally unable to feed themselves or look after their families, because they're so traumatized by the experiences of what have happened in the day. And it's not all the kind of big ticket stuff about we made this mistake and somebody died, or we had this error and there was some huge problem or outcome of that. It's the more low level stuff that's happening continuously. So for the third time this week, I didn't have enough staff on shift to deliver the quality of care I want to deliver, or I didn't get time to take a break today, or I didn't have a suitable, I got to take a break, but it was 4 o'clock and the canteen was closed and there wasn't anything to eat, and I hadn't brought any lunch with me, and it's 8 o'clock in the evening and haven't eaten. And I think for a long time, and particularly in the pandemic, we've kind of accepted those things as normal in healthcare. And I remember early on in my career wearing a kind of badge of honor, getting to the end of a 12-hour shift and having not been to the toilet. That was one of our patients, we'd be absolutely screaming, saying there's something wrong with this guy. He hasn't been to the loo in 12 hours. What are we going to do about it? But, we thought that was great. And we thought, God, didn't I do a great job? I didn't stop today. Well, I didn't do a great job, did I? I wasn't looking after myself, and I certainly wasn't looking after my colleagues, because that's not normal, and it's not good for us as humans to be tolerating. I think, within healthcare, there's been a huge amount of attention to this over the last few years. And, we moved from that kind of vision of healthcare providers and professionals as heroes. We had clap for the carers, clap for care providers. We had, I did some shifts. I was living in Northern Ireland during the first lockdown, and did some shifts in our local acute COVID ward. And, literally the local takeaways were bringing in bags and bags and bags of food every day. And for the first few weeks, it was great. It was really appreciated. People really loved that kind of hot meal, that real sense of respect and value from the community. But after a while, you were leaving shift, walking past food that people just couldn't eat because there was just too much of it. And it was help, but not necessarily the right help at the right time. And it got me really thinking at the time about what we do in my organization and what we do for our colleagues and each other. So, for us, there is a lot of that. There's a lot of making sure that services are open and available to individuals. So, if you're working in the middle of the night, can you get something nutritious and tasty to eat? Do you have an appropriate place to sit and eat that, where you can be away from the work environment and have time to have a proper break if that's what you need to do? And we work really hard to make sure that is available across the 24-hour period, which comes with its challenges. But also things like mindfulness mornings. So, twice a week we run a session in the hospital where individuals have, it can either be in person or via Teams, but, have 30 minutes of just guided meditation and self-awareness, where people actually are encouraged to stop, to take a breather before the beginning of the workday and just think about themselves, their sense of well-being, what they need. in addition to the kind of things you might expect around confidential wellbeing services and support lines that people can call, we very early on got into the mental health first aider concept and trained a huge amount of really willing colleagues who came forward to take on that role. And I was really staggered by the number of people who put themselves forward to train as mental health first aiders, because it really showed me actually that a lot of people recognized it as a problem, a lot of people, but equally a lot of people thought they could be part of the solution. And we've got this huge network of individuals where, it could vary from, I'm really struggling. I've had a really hard period of work. I'm really struggling to get myself through this next period, and I need some proper guidance and help and support, right up to, look, I've had a really tough day and I just need someone to talk to. And creating those opportunities has felt really important. And I think important for me as a leader to do that. And, I would say with great pride that I probably spend 15 or 20% of my week just talking to staff about how the job is going, how they're doing, what things are going well, what things they need help with. Not always solution focused, because there isn't a solution for everything in the right here and now, but really making sure that people feel heard, people feel able to get those feelings out and understand where the options are to get help, or where the solutions are, where they exist. And that's a thing I think that working in a small hospital really does deliver, because there's very few people in my organization that couldn't call out on a first name basis, and that's really helpful with stuff like this.
It's really good. Just conscious of time, so we'll move on to the next slide. A big kind of talking point in this presentation is nurse recruitment, how you recruit, you train and you retain your nurses. It's a really challenging environment for every single organization. We've seen the numbers of vacancies. We've seen kind of how many nurses are potentially leaving the system, but we also know it's incredibly competitive, right? Every single organization is looking for the same people. You won't find an NHS trust or even an independent provider that hasn't got vacancies. There's a systemic issue when it comes to the workforce and staffing. And I think, what we really want to kind of understand, and we'll move on to kind of the next slide, is how are you going about your recruitment? What are you doing differently? And how are you attracting nurses to your organization?
Yeah, thank you. And some of the stats we've talked to already, but I think for us and for, this is not something that's necessarily unique to us, because I think everyone's being very quickly skilled into the things that are necessary. But, there are, simply put, more jobs than there are people to fill those jobs. People have a high level of choice and a high level of opportunity when it comes to picking an employer. And, when I first qualified as a nurse, I took a job in Cheltenham, which, frankly, was a place at the time I'd never heard of. It's 100 miles away from where I was living. It wasn't what I had thought about, but at the time that there were, so many new graduates and not enough jobs, and I felt really lucky to have a job that it just felt like the right thing to do. But that's not where we are right now. We've got nurses who absolutely can enter into those opportunities all over the place, and I think what it's done is really forced employers and providers to step up, and rightly so. And I think it's given us that real opportunity to say, how do we make us stand out? How do we make our organization the place of choice that people want to come to, and perhaps even more importantly, that people want to stay at once they do come to. So it's really about keeping things simple and getting the basics right and doing it really consistently for us. So that consistent and authentic engagement. So you come to work for a place, you find a manager that you think you're really excited to work with, a team that you think you're really excited to work with. You go through that interview process, you decide to take the job, and then some of you will have been through this experience. You get your contract, and then the next person you speak to, somebody from onboarding or HR that actually might have no contact or connection to the place you're going in to work in. And you know what? That feels, as a candidate, really isolating. It feels really, it feels a bit like you're on your own, and you're working your notice, you're waiting, what next? So we really try and break that down. So genuine, authentic engagement during that process, right down from making sure that from that point of becoming part of the organization at contractual signing, that people are getting our newsletters on a regular basis. They know what's going on in the organization. They get pictures of key people across the organization. They can identify leaders, managers, key people in the organization, so that you're not walking in on your first day thinking, oh my God, there's 400 new people here I've never met. And at least you can kind of put a face to a name and a role, and that feels really important. It's absolutely about reducing that candidate burden and removing red tape. So, I went to a recruitment fair not so long ago, and a candidate said, oh, look, I'm really interested in the role, but do you know what? I'm really busy at work. I haven't had time to update my CV, but, I filled in an NHS job application. It has all the information in it. Could you take that? And the immediate kind of answer in the system is, well, no, because that's not how our system's set up. But actually, what does it matter? You've got the information that we need. Let's take it. Let's support candidates to do that in the right way. And for us, it's about constantly challenging ourselves and each other in those, why are we doing it in this way? And is it the right thing to be doing right now? And how do we make that better to get rid of that red tape? And, the best experience of that I've had is just through asking candidates, because nobody will tell you truer what it's like to be recruited than someone who's just been through it and gone through that mill for 3 months. So, I try and speak to new people as they onboard and say, what did we get right? What didn't we get right? What do we do better next time? Because you get those lessons, and they are, fundamental to what we do.
Absolutely. The national average for kind of that hiring ability to fill jobs is 115 days. That's the worst out of any industry, healthcare. That's general. That's encompassing the NHS as well. And I think one thing you've mentioned here is that red tape. Is how do you remove a lot of that red tape? I was speaking to a nurse the other day, and I actually put this on my LinkedIn, that he told me that he spent half an hour filling out an application form for a job. He stopped halfway through and continued. And my view is that actually, do you know what? That nurse could have finished that application and then gone to work in that hospital, but that hospital didn't know that this nurse had stopped the application. And I was thinking that hospital could have, and that nurse could have wanted to go and work in that. That could have been one of their top options. And I actually thought, well, actually, that hospital, putting the nurse to one side, that hospital has just lost. It was a theatre, it was a scrub practitioner. So that hospital was just lost, potentially lost if they interviewed well, a really, really good theatre practitioner. And it just made me think about, there's just too much red tape. Hiring needs to be fast, it needs to be efficient, and it needs to be effective. And effective, in my view, is that two-way process where you've just said a few things, where the nurses are effectively in demand, they're in demand, they're in control, they've got choice. So it should be a two-way interview. Not only is the nurse telling us great things about themselves, but you are telling the nurse how great a place it is to come and work here, and really explaining to them, what they can achieve in this organization. Because I've seen a lot of interviews where, they just, okay, tell us about yourself, but they forget to tell the nurse about how they're going to fit in here and what the culture and the values are like here. So I think
that's
there's
vital.
a lot of things there that resonate with me. And I think as an industry, we need to do, as a sector, we need to do better. And that's a big mission of ours at Medimatch, is bringing down that time to hire, but making that experience incredibly candidate friendly and candidate orientated, because you are nurses 100% in control.
Yeah, it's hugely important. And as a leader and manager in healthcare, it's taken a little while for myself personally, but my team, the people around me, to learn that. But once they got it, it makes things better so much quicker. Yeah. So it's incredible. It's worth probably moving on into the next slide, because I'm just really mindful of time and some of the key things I wanted to get out. But I think one of the things that's really important for us is absolutely understanding the needs of our candidates, of our onboardees and our new staff and those with us, particularly around things like inclusion, diversity, and we have a really active, we call it our READY network, but it's Racial Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Network, which is a staff-owned and managed committee and structure that really works to make sure the hospital is as inclusive and equal opportunities as it can be. And it's been really formative for me as a new executive team member in a hospital. And bear in mind, I've only been in a hospital executive team since kind of December time last year. So, to walk into that environment where the group of staff are telling me, look, this is what we need to feel included. This is what we need to feel heard. This is what we need to feel authentic. It's just phenomenal, because do you know what? People get it. They understand what they want. They understand what success looks like. And everybody taking responsibility for that is something really unique for me, both in jobs I've done recently, but currently now, because it just gives us all that opportunity to be really honest with each other, to be really open, and to say, what do you need to be a success here, and what do we need for you to be successful here? And being open-minded, I think, is probably one of the most important pieces of advice. And I've said it a couple of times during this session, but there's no such thing as an opportunity that won't deliver something or some degree of benefit. And you know what? Being open to trying new things, and if it doesn't work, be brave enough to say it hasn't worked. Let's do something else.
Definitely agree with that. Let's move on to talk about training and retaining staff, because for me this is, I'm incredibly passionate about career progression and the ability to retain staff. You do not want to be hiring staff and then seeing others leave through the back doors. So I'm really interested. You mentioned about diversity, equality, and inclusion, which is a massive talking point and a really important aspect of any organization. But talk to me about other things that you do at Bupa that maybe others can learn from, that may be unique, and things that you're doing, differently and well.
So I think, it's not too small of a point to make to say that the focus on staff experience has to be relentless. It has to be at least as important, if not more important, than your customer experience goals. So, like it or hate it, but there's a quote from Richard Branson a few years ago where he says, look after the staff and they'll look after your customers. It's really true. Yeah. It genuinely is. And people have their individual feelings about the source of that quote, but the reality is, if you've got a really engaged workforce who are happy at what they're doing, they'll do a number of things. They'll bring their best selves to work every day, and they'll bring that customer experience with them. But more importantly, they'll tell you when you haven't got it right, and they'll tell you when you need to do things differently. And what we have at Bupa is that absolute focus. So we've recently aligned and made a really ambitious target to align our staff engagement scores in our feedback surveys and our staff surveys with our patient experience targets, because actually the two are as important as each other. And every single manager at the Cromwell and in Bupa has really bought into that level of experience. So as an executive team member, I have a responsibility for good customer experience, but I have an absolute responsibility and accountability for good staff experience. And that means listening to what people say, identifying solutions, helping people get them in. It doesn't mean doing everything for people. It doesn't mean, giving people every single thing they ask for, but it means really understanding what people need to work here. And what that's done for my team is given them the freedom to know such things as silly ideas. So, we had someone recently say, look, we'd really like to try self-rostering. And for a number of years, we've been thinking about self-rostering, and we've said, well, it's quite tricky, it's difficult to do, the technology might not support what we need to do, it's going to be really difficult, we're a bit worried about how it might go. And actually, when we've unburdened ourselves of that and started thinking about what's the goal, well, the goal is to make this the best place to work. This is what our people are telling us they want. Let's just make it happen. And we did it. And you know what? It was really successful, because our teams wanted it, our managers wanted to make it work. We got the technology to do what we needed to do, and it was just great, because it didn't particularly cost a lot of money. It wasn't particularly revolutionary. Lots of people have been doing it for a long time, but it was the right thing for us to do at the right time. And that's really special for me, is just having that just being brave enough to do that. And I think a lot of organizations are stepping into that now, but it's something that we're really passionate about and makes a huge difference at the Cromwell. I think in addition to that, it's really about thinking about how we work differently. So many of you will know that there's a new level of registration in the Nursing and Midwifery Council in the UK around nursing associates and this kind of allied health professional, bridging that gap between unregistered healthcare support workers and registered nurses. And not many independent sectors have fully embedded this role yet. We're really looking at that and bringing it in and looking at how that frees our nurses, our registered nurses, up to delivering at the top of their license. And it's hugely important that people are able to operate right at the top of that space, both for a staff morale perspective, but also to make sure our patients and customers are getting the best possible care from the people providing it. We've also had a massive focus on international recruitment.
Yeah,
I've seen a few.
That was my next
questions.
question. Because I think we've got quite a few international nurses joining us tonight. I think it's a really interesting topic. Tell us a little bit about that.
I think it is. So, what we've always had at the Cromwell and at Bupa is a really diverse workforce, and we've always had, people come from all over the world to work in the organisation, but they've often come in, they've been working in other places in the UK, and then they've come to work for us, a couple of years later down their journey. We've now really realised that actually stepping into that, bringing people in right at the very beginning of their journey, making this a target place to work and creating that really great culture around it is a hugely important thing to do. And we've had our first cohort of international nurses join us in June time of this year. They're just about to go through their OSCE and registration process next week. And, for us, it's so exciting and just absolutely awe-inspiring, because you have a group of people. We had 10 nurses came over and were sitting in a room chatting to me. And, we just went round the room and they said, hi, I'm Steve and I've got X number of years of experience. And I just added up the years people were telling me. In the room, we had 130 years of nursing experience. It's just incredible because, it's like nothing else you ever get. So we're really open-minded about it. We've got a big ambition around international focus of recruitment. And I think it's probably the way of the future, to be really honest. And you need a real mixture, but it's something that's such a rich source of experience, of diversity and of inclusion. And it's just massively useful for providers and for staff, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also you've mentioned something really important there, the number of years of experience. And I think a lot of nurses are coming from overseas into the UK healthcare system and are bringing a wealth of experience. And we've got to use that experience. We've got to leverage off of that experience. People are going to come with various different situational type experience. People are going to come with management experience. People are going to come a lot of clinical experience, treating different types of patients as well. So I think, it's something that we are, you are looking at, and something that we are going to be supporting organizations with through our technology. But I think, for me, as an advocate for international recruitment and someone that's, been in this space for 12 years, I think that candidate experience, that experience you give the nurses around the welcome and around about that first day and around about, that career progression and being on a journey with you, I think is so important. So I'm really excited to see how your first cohort do at the Cromwell. And I know from speaking to your team, you're looking to hire more and more international nurses across the whole organisation, not just the Cromwell, the care homes as well.
Absolutely.
So that is really exciting. Just go on to, because I want to get onto the Q&A in a couple of minutes. Talk quickly, 30 seconds, just about kind of that career progression framework you're talking about here, and some of kind of the other things that you're doing that stand out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much embedded in what we've said already, but I think the focus is absolutely on making our environment the most exciting and best place to work. And what we really have in terms of opportunities is constantly evolving care pathways, so constantly doing new services, new things, new ways, new models of working. And that delivers nursing staff the opportunity to step into really frontline roles of making those things work. So, clinical nurse specialist roles, specialist practitioner routes, in the standard clinical way that people might expect of becoming an expert in practice and leading a particular element of care, right up to actually, we've got something that we need to make happen. And we've got this really passionate nurse over here who's been involved in it for a little while, who could take it on And it's so special at the minute because it just gives nurses, I think, this really unique opportunity to get absolutely stuck in at day zero and say, this is how things should work and this is how we should do things. So it's such an exciting time in practice, both clinically and managerially at the minute.
And just quickly on some of these career progression framework and across, across all specialties. I'm a nurse. I'm coming into ICU, let's say, for instance. How can you help me progress my career? Is it, courses? Is it leadership? Is it the ICU course? I mean, and then when I've got my ICU course, is it masters? Are you sponsoring masters or?
Yeah, so I think it's all of those things. So we are really committed to those core frontline clinical skills. So we're absolutely supporting people through academic ICU courses, through theatre courses, through specialist practitioner courses, where those skills are necessary for the role and for progression. And then supporting people. Bupa, what Bupa has in spades is this huge access to a really diverse leadership capability and network. So we've got staff at every level of the organization with access to different levels of formal and informal leadership and managerial and frontline leadership qualifications. So we've got a bespoke program in the Cromwell for that change from band 5 to band 6 and stepping into that leadership role and what that means and how you bring yourself into that role. So it's something I think that we're really passionate about, that we work really hard to create opportunity for and to fund significantly, which is really important both for teams but also for the organization. But that could look like going and doing some master's level training, but it also could look like going and spending a few weeks or a few months in a different part of Bupa, being exposed to a different part of the organization and really learning through seeing how it's done in other areas. And what that opportunity, I think, for us is unique because although we are a kind of standalone hospital, we have access to this vast healthcare network right across the country and the world, which you wouldn't necessarily have in other places outside of the NHS, particularly.
Fantastic. Okay, brilliant. Let's move on because just conscious of time. Move on to the next one. So thank you, Steve. You've answered a lot of my questions and you've been absolutely fantastic. You can't run away right now, okay? You've got to stay put for the Q&A. But I just wanted to give people a quick 20-30 seconds on MediMatch. Our whole mission is to empower healthcare professionals to do the job they love. We do this by creating tools that they need to be matched with organizations and to help them improve their career. We are a technology platform. We've created breakthrough talent match technology. And we are the first of its kind in the UK that turns recruitment on its head. And rather than the candidates apply to the jobs apply to the candidates. And that is done through our algorithmic matching technology. And the reason we created this technology was because we know that there is a massive demand for healthcare professionals and obviously a shortage of supply. Bupa, in fact, is using our technology. When I asked you how you recruit your nurses, I thought you were going to say MediMatch, but I'll forgive you for that. But yes, there are some nurses in this group that have been recruited through the MediMatch technology. But we're more than just a technology platform. We also have nurses that work for the organization. We support nurses with career advice, with CV help, with interview coaching, and just general support if you ever have any concerns. We do have a team of nurses that are here to help every single day. We run these virtual events, webinars, pretty much every single month. We also are running a social event for nurses next week. When we talk about empowerment, we talk about mental health and well-being. We are all about supporting nurses, letting your hair down, getting out of that work environment and just having fun and having a good time and meeting like-minded people. So the next one, I believe, is next Friday. We'll put it in the chat so people know when it's going to be. And we're also about community, bringing people together from all walks of life. Whether you come from overseas or whether you come from a different part of the UK, we're all about building a community and bringing healthcare professionals and nurses closer together. So that is an end to this wonderful presentation. And it's been a great conversation. You've been awesome, Steve. I just want to ask you, just before we go on to the Q&A, I want to ask you, if you had a nurse sitting in your office about to leave the profession, what is that kind of one sentence that you would give them, maybe a bit more than one sentence, to say, hold on, stop. This is why we do the job.
Wow, you really put me on the spot there. This is my punishment for not citing Medimatch in my slide, isn't it? Do you know what? I think it's about really taking it back to the basics. What is it that brought you into the profession? What is it that got you here in the first place? And you know, how do we get you back to that space, or how do you get yourself back to that space? Because if we think about nurses or clinical professionals, you know, most of us have come into these roles because we really enjoy working with people, or we really want to make a difference for perhaps in someone's condition, or the way they feel, or the way they are physically or mentally. And actually, when you look at the reasons why people are leaving, you know, none of those things are on your list. It's not a loss of love for the job that's causing people to move out of it. I think the biggest piece of advice we can give colleagues in that position is, you know, find that thing that got you here and get yourself back to that. And if that's about changing a job, if it's about changing organization, then be brave enough to do that. And, you know, I've sat in front of really great colleagues who, frankly, I would have really loved not to have moved on from the organization that I'm working in at the time. But you know, it was the right thing for them to do. And as a manager, sitting back and saying, I get it, I understand it's the right thing for you and you should do it, and supporting them to do it is so important, because, you know, 3 years later, that staff member came back and worked for us again because they had what they needed at the time. And you know, that's not historically what organizations do, because the goal is to keep you, right? But if that's not the right thing, then it's not the right thing.
Great. We'll now move on to the final part, which is the question and answer session. I'll try and get through as many of the questions in the next 5 minutes. If they're related to kind of HR questions, the best thing to do, because of the time constraints, is to email hello@medimatch.io, and we'll pick that up after the presentation. Because as much as I want to direct them at you, Steve, you probably direct them back at me. So, or your HR. So let's start. I'll pick them out at random. As a nurse interviewing at a hospital, is it always worth going in to visit the department and meeting the team? I guess that's if you are local or within the same country, I guess.
Yeah, I think it really depends on what's open to you and what's available. And if you think about, you know, in recent times, I've interviewed for jobs that have been down the corner from me, around the corner from my house, but I couldn't go in because of COVID, so it wasn't practicable or possible. I think at very least, you absolutely need to know the culture of the place you're going into and what that looks like and feels like. I think technology is so much better now than it used to be, and there really genuinely are ways of doing that outside of a physical visit. So, you know, ask to talk to colleagues who work in the environment, ask to talk to colleagues who perhaps no longer work in the environment, who've chosen to leave, if that's an option, and understand some of the reasons around those, because I think that richness of detail comes from so many sources. You know, tools like Medimatch have a great source of detail with that. Internet review platforms, although treat them with a level of skepticism, but, you know, there's information out there that can help you assess the culture of a place, both within and out of a visit. If you can do it, I'd highly recommend it, but I don't think it's a deal breaker in every case.
Great. Just a quick one, I guess a yes or no. Do you have nurse consultant roles?
Yes, across a number of different specialities.
Brilliant. Great. Good answer. What advantages does the independent sector have over mirrored roles in the NHS?
Do you know, it's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure advantages is always the right word to describe it. I think it's different, and I think those differences can be both positive and less positive in spaces. I think for me, the most important thing is about being able to effect change at scale really quickly, because you can often get an idea from generation to implementation in a few weeks or months in a small independent sector hospital, whereas in a big NHS organisation where there's a necessary amount of space to go through, that can take much longer.
Okay. And I guess this is a follow-on question. Do you think it's better for nurses to have experience in both the public and private health sector? If not, why not?
Again, I'm not sure about the choice of the word better. I think everybody brings with them their own experience from different environments. I think in the early part of your career, it's so important to be exposed to different ways of doing things and to understand how that works. And I certainly feel more well-rounded having worked in both. And you know, recently during COVID, I got the opportunity to go back to the NHS, and it was really enlightening, because there were things that our local NHS hospital were doing that we just hadn't caught up with yet. And I thought, oh my God, you know, we've got to get with this program. And I think it's both. I think you get such richness from both environments, and they're neither better nor worse than each other. It's around, you know, timing and what's right for you as an individual at the time.
Great. This is a longer question, so I'll try and summarize this. How do we make sure that we have the clear competency-based scoring system, or a system that we have in place to deliver that clean and clear line that divides between a staff nurse to becoming a nurse in charge? Often most, if not always, the root of a fallout is when we set our staff to fail instead of succeeding. And that is when we force them to mature beyond their years. And that is when the leadership fails to acknowledge preparedness versus willingness in terms of the skills. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And actually, I read that question as it came through with great interest, because I've got I have a real personal example of that. So, you know, I was 3 months qualified. I was working on a really busy ward. It was 28 beds. We should have had 4 nurses on shift. I turned up, it was me and 3 agency nurses who'd never worked in the hospital before. And literally the night nurse in charge handed me a set of keys and said, good luck. And I thought, holy God. We got to the end of that 12-hour shift, and I had some really fantastic agency nurses with me who frankly saved both my life and the life of some of the patients that day. You know, where I thought, how are we in this space? How is this okay to treat people like this? And I got back to my manager and I said, I don't want to work like this. I'm really happy if you need me to step up and you need me to work in that space, but I need you to give me the skills to do it and the exposure to do it and the training to do it. And for me, in my current role, that's one of the things I've really stood by is actually it's about understanding that is going to happen. People are going to be in a space where they're going to have to step up. So let's deal with it in advance. Let's give them the tools early on. Let's identify those people who want to do it, and encourage those people who perhaps are less keen but may need to, and give people the skills and the exposure early on. And, you know, cost's really important in every sector. Availability of staff is really important. It may feel like spending time having staff being supernumerary, shadowing people who are more experienced is difficult to justify if you haven't got the staff or the resources, but it's probably one of the most important things we do, is just give people time to watch how the job's done, to learn how it's done from their peers, so that if you do end up in that position, actually you'll feel okay getting through it. And the other thing is have somebody in mind that you can call. So when you're in that position, who are you ringing? And I hope if you ask some of my team, I'll be on that list of phone numbers, but you know, if I'm not, I know they'll have a list of people who really support them and be able to step up and give them that support when they need it.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have kind of like I guess an open door policy? What are your kind of leadership takeaways from tonight? You know, for our nurses to take away? Is it kind of that open door policy? Is it that ability to you know, ring you know, whenever, or like you said, checking in on them? What is kind of because that's the end, what is kind of those few points that you would want people to take away?
Yeah, do you know, it's all of those things, and it might not necessarily be me, but other leaders or managers in the organization. You know, who is the person that you most feel embodies that leadership style that you want to be part of, and how do you get contact with them. Really interestingly, I've had to put my phone on silent during this because I've had 3 or 4 of my team text me during this just to ask me how this event was going. So do you know what? You get it both ways round. So I hope my team get it from me, but I get it from them as well. And that's fantastic. Is open door doesn't always mean that, you know, free access coming every time you want, but it's I need you, or you here, and how do I get that support? And we've got those really clear lines of communication. And you know, I've got a nurse colleague who interviewed me for my first qualified nurse job 15 years ago, who I still text randomly and say, oh my God, I have no idea what I'm doing. Can you help me? It's massively important.
Great. And my last question, I promise, Steve, I'll let you go because I'm sure you've got to get in early for work tomorrow. Did you have a role model within nursing? Did you look up to anyone? Was anyone kind of your you know, that pinnacle, that anyone, like, you know, the person that really kind of, you know, really helped you kind of motivate you?
Yeah, again, a really interesting question. I think there were 3 people for me who fulfilled that role. One's a personal example. So an aunt of mine was a neonatal intensive care sister in Belfast in the 70s and 80s, and she used to come home with such horror stories. So, you know, in those days of checkpoints and various challenges in Northern Ireland, Caroline wouldn't take her passport to work, for example, in case she ended up having to go on a transfer because, you know, whoever had the passport in the locker was the person who did that. And I thought, my God, you know, this is a profession that has that ability to help people in that really instant way. So she was a really important role model for me. I think early on in my career, there were 2 people I can think of. One of them is that person I've just talked about that I text now and say, you know, help. And that was an individual who was a senior staff nurse when I was a student nurse, and then a newly qualified nurse in the same environment. And it was a person who, you know, just always was open to challenge and open to understanding how we do things, and open to being called out when things gone wrong. And I remember being on a shift one day as a student nurse who was working with this individual. We'd had a horrible day. Things hadn't gone quite to plan. There had been a bit of a mistake in care where something that should have happened hadn't happened. There was no massive outcome, but you know, it shouldn't have happened. And we were at handover, and I was really nervous about how it might go. And the nurse on the next shift was saying, God, you didn't do this. Why didn't you do it? And she just stood up and said, do you know what? We got it wrong. We're going to learn from it, and we're not going to do it like that next time. And I thought, wow, that's what I want to be like. And that individual, I think, was just massively formative for me. And the third's actually someone who worked for me, who did the same in reverse, and said, why are you doing it that way? You know, why are we behaving in the way we're behaving? Why are we working in the way we're working? And who offered that challenge and was brave enough to do it to someone who was in a managerial role to them, you know, because they didn't have to, but they did. And that was hugely important.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Well, I know we've gone over time because that was a really interesting discussion. So thank you everyone for attending tonight. I know some people have dropped off, probably late in certain countries around the world. We've had people listening in from all different parts of the world, which is amazing. So thank you everyone for joining. A big round of applause to our audience, and also a massive round of applause to Steve for giving up his Sunday evening to talk to us tonight about his career, but also some really important topics about recruitment, retention, and of course training within his organizations and experiences. So that's the end of the webinar. If you have any questions, please email hello@medimatch.io. If you want to direct any questions to Steve, feel free to email us, and we can forward them on to Steve. And if you want to check out our website, it's www.medimatch.io. Without further ado, I'd like to say a massive round of applause to Steve, and if we can kind of do a virtual clap, that would be awesome. So yeah, thank you so much. And now I'm going to close the link. If your colleagues want to view it, we'll be able to share it around after. But yeah, everyone's saying thank you in the chat. So appreciate all of that.
Super.
Thank
Thanks
you.
everybody, and thanks for your time and being so engaging in the questions. Have a great evening.
Bye.